So welcome everyone. Katie Bosco, faculty of anthropology, and I, and Anne O'Dwyer, who's here, and who will be in greater flourish in 2 weeks from now, co-hosting. Our speaker then are here to welcome you on behalf of social studies, and Nate Sadowski, who's our host with the most, coming direct from the provost, who's now helping us out as a teaching assistant. So it's like a mutually symbiotic thing. We're saving him, he's saving us. So, but it's really lovely to have him in class today. So yeah, we are very excited to have Zoe Samudzi with us here today. And I take full responsibility, full exclusive responsibility of kind of stalking her and then bringing her here. So I of course, with everything that our world is right now, and I said this in class before, that like one is always finding reassurances around us in whatever ways we can. And I think I read something Zoe wrote about the difference between diverse and decolonial education, but also I think a piece that was very richly sort of arguing for, in my view, a deprovincializing identity, right, in a certain way that are allowing us to escape the straitjacket that's imposed by representational politics, right? But still being able to do like really deep, critical Black study and anti-racist work and decolonial work at the same time as actually being necessary to each other. So, of course, she comes to us from many places, but most recently flew in from San Francisco, where she's in the PhD program in sociology, but her time before in England studying and also studying social psychology for her graduate work, and also epidemiology as a sort of a broader political social thing rather than a narrow public health perspective, and actually kind of bringing all the things that we do in the broader transdisciplinary social sciences to do actual interventions in policy, but also in actual activist organizing, which concerns a lot of our students who are in the room today. So I won't keep her from you, but I just wanted to sort of say, like, our class today was, it was very, very instructive how she began by, it's very interesting, like if somebody assigns 5 writings, 5 pieces, and one of them was hers, and then proceeds to, instead of kind of accruing kind of centrality in that cluster of 5, to kind of actually in a truly generous and intellectually kind of collaborative and like hospitable mode, actually letting one of the authors be sort of kind of a centerpiece, and I think I had to kind of draw her out of that, like okay, no, let's maybe see what it would look like if we could figure it differently, and if your work was the one that was anchoring these. And it's not about who anchors what, but I think it's always a lovely thing when you're the one suggesting to someone to make themselves more central, because most of the world doesn't sort of like accrues that privilege to themselves. So I think that's what we do for each other when we are at our best. So that's a lesson for all of us to have. But just to kind of go through the kind of simple, like kind of more bare bones thing. I love that her dissertation for her MA was called "I Don't Believe I Should Be Treated Like a Second Citizen by Anybody. Narratives of Agency and Exclusion Amongst Male and Transgender Female Sex Workers in Cape Town, South Africa." So just if you even in Simon's Rock fashion did a text explosion of that title, right? And it's not because it's a long title like Simon's Rock, like it's like, oh, colon, what was it, Dead Duck or Phoenix, right? Like there's 3 titles of Simon's Rock. But I think this is something that can show you, right? This is what reading is, if you can see within the span of that title, like the multiple spaces to which Zoe is accountable, and the multiple kind of without the conceit of discipline and the conceit of being disciplined, like able to bring, like I mean, I want to read the thesis, but I just feel like I found that to be the work you're doing, connecting, and I hope and wish that your pen remains powerful as the sword, as a Muslim would say, right? And so, and I hope that, you know, we see better times together. So thank you for being here, and let's welcome Zoe Samudzi.
Hello. I'm going to be a little bit reliant on my notes because I'm really nervous. As kind of a heads up, my presentation, what I'm talking about, is quite rooted in a lot of discussion of like Nazism and the kind of technologies of mass murder and violence. So my talk today is called Effective Statecrafting and the American Regulatory Politics of Fear. And what's the easiest way to... Yeah, let's just do that. Okay, so I'm going to start out with some working definitions first. I'm using and adapting the concept of effective economies from philosopher Sarah Ahmed. So she defined, or I am rather defining effective economies as socio-political economies that revolve around the discursive employments or appeals to politicized emotion. And they act here as the roots of American nationalism because individuals are aligned with the communities that are constructed out of the languages that get employed. Then statecrafting, which are the processes of state identity formation, whether internal or externally facing, through trade, foreign policy, etc. And then you have regulatory, which are the varied means through which the state seeks to shape internal structures and identity politics as well as citizen behavior. And I wanted to start by defining things because sometimes I find myself reading people like Sylvia Wynter and I don't know what she's talking about and I don't know what the words mean, and you can only understand what the words mean through what she's saying, and she doesn't ever define them. And so I just wanted to kind of preclude that. So she uses an example of a quote from the Aryan Nation website as the kind of foundation of her paper in the definition of effective economy. And she says, "The depths of love are rooted and very deep in a real white nationalist soul and spirit. No form of hate could even begin to compare. At least not a hate motivated by ungrounded reasoning. It is not hate that makes the average white man look upon a mixed-race couple with a scowl on his face and loathing in his heart. It is not hate that makes the white housewife throw down the daily Jews paper in repulsion and anger after reading of yet another child molester or rapist sentenced by corrupt courts to a couple short years in prison or on parole. It is not hate that makes the white working man curse about the latest boatload of aliens dumped on our shore to be given job preference over the white citizen who built this land. It is not hate that brings rage into the heart of a white Christian farmer when he reads of billions loaned or given away as aid to foreigners when he can't get the smallest break from an unmerciful government to save his failing farm. No, it's not hate, it is love." The subject here, of course, is whiteness personified. It's the nationalist, it's the average white man, it's the Christian farmer, it's the housewife, and so on. And the subject is being positioned as being in a position of danger by these racialized others who are presented as posing a threat to their safety, security, wealth, jobs, families, and so on. They not only have access to the subject's resources, but are in a position to potentially displace the subject, both in their ability to have a livelihood, but also in an unspoken position of racialized dominance. And then to quote Ahmed, she says, "The presence of these others is imagined as a threat to the object of love. Here, that love being the love of and for whiteness. This involves a particular racialized epistemology, a white ignorance, and a historical revisionism, asserting both an ownership and construction of this land, and this kind of mythology that farmers aren't massively subsidized by the state, and a positioning of whites as both past and potential future victims. It is thus a love for this unsubtly white nation and its rightful occupants that drives this white nationalist hate." So quintessential Americanness, thus, is an identity or layers of overlapping identities, was largely formed and is continually reproduced in reaction to these imagined threats and these fear-based political economies. And they play critical roles in developing the languages to describe both these threats and the reactive identities that emerge therefrom. Fear is one of nationalism's most important tools. It's the most easily employable, and its effective sentiment in our political imagination, and the one that is most readily available for social and political manipulations. So, next slide. So I'm going to give first 2 global examples of affective economies before I get into the American one. So first, we have Zwart Gevaar, which is Afrikaans for the Black Peril. And it's one of the most critical features of Southern African settler colonialisms and was a justification for apartheid violence. And if you don't recognize this lovely young gentleman, that is Dylan Roof, who is the alleged shooter of the Charleston massacre. So these imagined threat to whiteness, coupled with the civilizing missions of religious evangelism and liberalism, drove racialized securitizations of the world for the propagation and flourishment of whiteness, aka colonialism. This fear of blackness spoke to white entitlement to land occupied by black natives, and there was a subsequent construction of apartheid settler states to ensure the securitization for this expropriated land, necessarily through deprivation, disenfranchisement of black Africans. So Zwart Gevaar very interestingly transforms into Rooi Gevaar. Rooi Gevaar means the red peril. This, of course, is the fear of communism. Come the post-World War II Cold War era formation of anti-colonial movements in South Africa and across the continent. So Rooi Gevaar refers to the threat that is presented by communism, as the Soviets and the Chinese supported many African liberation efforts. And anti-communism, quite interestingly, becomes a proxy for anti-blackness, because due to the political orientations and ideologies of religious groups, of liberation groups, free blacks are communist blacks. And black liberation necessarily contradicts Western democracy, both through the affront of black freedom, but also through the affront of communism. Rhodesia and the Union of South Africa, interestingly, are a part of the American kind of paramilitary cultures and gun cultures, a part of the Settler International's history that came to light after the Charleston massacre, because Dylan Roof is wearing patches of both the Union of South Africa on the top and Rhodesia on the bottom. Rhodesia was kind of seen as this reclaimed Eden for whites within Africa that is overrun by black savagery. And so there were a lot of white folks, many of whom were actually Vietnam veterans, who fought as mercenaries for the Rhodesian military as well as the South African military against both blackness and communism. And it was this really interesting conversion of white macho hegemonic masculinity inherent to coloniality, these kind of jingoisms of the Cold War, quite explicit anti-blackness, and the romanticized kind of mythologies of settler colonizers. The second example of affective politics that I'm using is Zionism, which is the kind of constructed, ethnocentric, hyper-military ideologies underpinning the colonial Israeli state, the rights violation actions of which are justified by the rhetorics of the both Palestinian threat and the Muslim threat presented by the hostile neighborhoods surrounding it. And Zionism in Israel functions similarly within the settler international exported from the European empire. Concerns about anti-Semitism are unarguably historically and presently legitimate given the centuries of brutality in Europe, and even in the expulsion of Muslims from different of Jewish people, Jewish communities from Arab and Muslim states surrounding it. But the subsequent policies of genocide and collective punishment, ethnic cleansing, most substantially the one being the Nakba in 1949, which is a picture here, land expropriation, ghettoization, resource deprivation, and military occupation inflicted on Palestinian communities both in Israel and occupied Palestine following the creation of Israel are obviously both deeply unreasonable and illegal, but also consistent with the paranoias and the constant emergencies of settler states. So next slide. So now we have the existential threats posed to the United States, and I've kind of broken it into these 5 different threats. So first you have the savage native threats to European settlement. Then you have the Reconstruction era fears of newly emancipated black folks, because what does it mean when black people, these unpersons, these savage people are free? You have third, the global threat to democracy posed by the spread of fascism in Europe. You have the post-World War II Cold War threat to democracy that is then posed by the spread of communism. And then you have the civil rights movement and these kind of internal contestations of racial apartheid in the United States. Now, it's critical to recognize that every single one of these imagined threats is by and large hegemonic paranoia. That is not to, of course, say that the threat posed by Nazi Germany was not an incredibly real threat, because it absolutely unequivocally was. But it is, a lot of these are these articulations of dominant groups' fear of losing power. Like, it's no exaggeration or stretch of the imagination to say that these affective economies are simply varied articulations of the fears of whiteness, which, while are incredibly violent, are incredibly fragile. And Robin DiAngelo explores this quite beautifully on an interpersonal level in her paper, White Fragility. But rather than engaging these fear-based worldviews and figuring out how to mitigate these fears, figuring out where there are mythologies, where there's accuracy in them, power structures instead double down and escalate oppressive legislation, that is, the legitimate modes of violent regulation, and or use force in reaction to them. Some force perceived as either extreme or invisible, and thus made acceptable by the state's monopoly on legitimate violence. It's also really critical to note the ways in which global and American examples mirror one another. The way that the fear of communism and blackness are also very much present in the United States. And this reflects the nature of the settler international, the internationality of these exclusionary ideologies that were exported from the European empire to various locations. I guess most notably Canada, the United States, Australia, and Israel. So then, that's the historical timeline. These are kind of what I conceive as the contemporary threats to American sovereignty. You have the post-9/11 threat presented by the global jihad that we keep hearing about. You have the inability to secure borders and stem the influx of illegal immigration and migration. You have challenges to colonial constructs of sex and gender presented through feminisms and LGBT rights and liberation movements. And you have the movement for Black Lives presenting a further challenge to white supremacy that were distinct from the assimilatory aims of the first civil rights movement, or the mainstream politics of the first civil rights movement, where the kind of mainstream activists were championing citizenship, voting rights, entrance into the American system, whereas now you have much more frequently Black activists and thinkers advocating for abolition, for revolution, for vast structural transformation and overhaul. And then you also have whistleblowers and individuals that would expose the mechanisms of an unjust state. So for example, you have the way the state is quite brutally punishing Chelsea Manning right now. So of course, the state seeks to regulate and mitigate the perceived threats. So with the threat that's posed to gender coloniality, you have laws that enable sex and gender-based discrimination by employees. You have laws that bar same-sex, same-gender adoptions because of the ways that that whiteness seeks to reify and to protect the family. And you have standards of care gatekeeping transgender people's access to transition materials like hormones and surgeries, because we have this particular way of understanding bodies, understanding useful and right bodies within capitalism and within sort of cisnormativity. You have racialized carceral structures. You have the school-to-prison pipelines and other racially discriminatory disciplining in schools. You have race and class-based mass incarceration, because more than anything, capitalism means labor. And so, just on the 9th, you had incarcerated people all over the country protesting against the slavery that occurs in prison, because it's subsidized labor is pretty much akin to it's slavery. And then, of course, you have securitization. You have the U.S.-Mexico border fence and the literal edifices that prevent the entry of undesirables into your country. You have increasingly rigid asylum allowances. You have COINTELPRO and the infiltration of activism, activist circles and activist communities by the state. You have the mass surveillance of racialized communities. And you, of course, have hyper-policing, which, of course, only seems hyper because now we have the technologies to kind of see it more frequently. But I personally I'm not so keen to believe that it's ramped up any more than it has for the past centuries. And of course, all of these regulations are imposed as a means of maintaining state control over race and gendered bodies within racial capitalism's regime of labor and capital. So we are all simply labor and capital. You are useful because you are able to produce more labor and capital. So if you're a transgender woman and you cannot have children, you are useless as a woman. If you're a transgender man who ostensibly could have children, but you are useless as a man because you fail to conform to these particular standards of what it means to be a man. So now we have kind of the effect of politics in the 2016 presidential race. You have, on one hand, Donald Trump, and his kind of unprecedentedly explicit employment of the Southern strategy. So while the Southern strategy is something that has existed for decades, you don't necessarily have Republicans who are actively, or not actively, as he would like to pretend, but actively kind of courting white supremacists the way that he is. And then across the aisle, you have the reactive rhetoric of fears from progressives like Hillary Clinton, Elizabeth Warren, and others in the Democratic Party who are kind of warning about the political backsliding in the event of Trump's election. But what is not so apparent is that there's actually bipartisan support for the state securitizations that are kind of underpinning all of this political rhetoric, including the support for American policing and carceral structures, for neoliberalism and neoconservative foreign policies, and most fundamentally for white supremacy. So effective rhetorics, while they're most notably and frequently wielded by reactionary groups and within conservative or nationalist politics, they're actually bipartisan due to the nature of American democracy that is rooted in settler colonialism and rooted in whiteness. So Trump is mobilizing kind of an explicitly white nationalist base per the typical, but I think maybe in his case, heightened rhetorical visceralities of the Southern strategy. You know, he's speaking as a man who fears the danger of further loss of resources. He's speaking to threats of hegemonic dominance within America as a racial majoritarian state. He's employing ideas of a return to America's greatness to alleviate these threats. And of course, greatness, per the settler colony, can never be decoupled from empire. America's greatness was during these periods of near uncontested dominance abroad and maximized freedom for citizens. And citizenship necessarily only applies to white people because non-whiteness can never fully be citizen or fully exist as human within the settler colonial sovereign. Racial liberation, particularly for black and indigenous people, has always been synonymous with predation because of the way that racialized bodies are understood. And per these colonial constructions of racialized groups, built on this kind of encroachment and infringements on white freedom and securities are a threat that must necessarily be dealt with and alleviated. And now you have Hillary Clinton, for example, who seeks to placate the black reaction to state violence by describing a political climate where emotions are heightened on all sides, as though both sides are equally valid in this particular argument we seem to be having about white supremacy. And one side represents a racist reactionaryism, and the other side represents a call for racial justice, for equity, for equality. And the Dr. King that nobody likes to quote wrote in the letter from Birmingham jail that describes a white liberalism that is more invested in order than in justice. One that seeks to maintain a superficially reformed status quo where black people are placated and no longer dissent, but one where racial balances of power are not actually upset or compromised. The violence of whiteness is inherent to American political structures because the ideologies of the individuals who constructed this country were products of European liberalism that justified and complemented colonialism. And this expansion of American democracy, of Americanness, was necessarily the lessening and the destruction of indigenous space. And this speaks to Patrick Wolf's logic of elimination, where one greater square mile of America is one less square mile of Native American territory. So the United States as a liberal democracy is necessarily a colonial construct. And what we're seeing is a product of liberal democracy that is established from the ideology of European empire. The concept of race, of whiteness in itself, is colonial race science that has emerged from largely debunked as unscientific, but still utilized pseudosciences and racial classifications. So I quite like this quote by Walter Benjamin, and it says, "The tradition of the oppressed teaches us that the state of emergency in which we live is not the exception but the rule. We must attain a conception of history that is in keeping with this insight." And I like this quote so much because I think it very perfectly articulates the tension between whiteness effective economies and the lived realities of the community whose oppression is necessary in order for the state to thrive. And this state of emergency articulated in reaction to Western fears is the constant state of existence for oppressed people. And so I want to use, for example, the German Holocaust, which is unarguably one of the greatest evils of humanity. I don't speak French, so I'm about to butcher all of what I'm about to say. In his 1955 Discours sur le colonialisme, Aimé Césaire said that what the European Christian cannot forgive Hitler for is not the crime in itself. It is not the crime against man. It is not the humiliation of man as such. It is the crime against the white man, the humiliation of the white man, and the fact that he applied to Europe the colonialist procedures which until then had been reserved exclusively for the Arabs of Algeria, the coolies of India, and the niggers of Africa. In his 1947 The World in Africa, W.E.B. Du Bois said there was no Nazi atrocity, concentration camps, wholesale maiming and murder, the defilement of women, or ghastly blasphemy of children, which the Christian civilization of Europe had not long been practicing against colored folks in all parts of the world. So it's kind of critical to highlight the continuation of the necropolitical technologies from which Hitler and Nazi Germany drew inspiration, as well as his genocidal predecessor, General Lothar von Trotha, who was at the helm of the Herero and Namakwa mass exterminations in Namibia. So Nazi concentration camps, quite notably, were inspired by the American treatment of indigenous peoples, from the removal processes to the mass killings to reservations, as well as von Trotha's extermination of indigenous Namibian peoples and the imperial uses of slave labor camps during the Herero Wars in Namibia from 1904 to 1907. Part of the imperial German structure was Eugene Fischer, who was a scientist who conducted deeply unethical eugenicist experiments on African prisoners, on the mixed-race children of either Germans or Boers and indigenous black women, and others in Namibia prior to experimenting on Jewish people for the Nazis. And while his evils and the evils of many people who participated in the Nazi regime are characterized as being unique to Imperial Germany, or unique to Nazi fascism, or unique to a kind of German evilness, Francis Galton, for example, was widely honored and praised by European intellectuals, and his legacy goes largely unproblematized by University College London that houses the Galton collection. He institutionalized and propagated eugenics in Britain in the mid to late 19th century, and eugenics was incredibly commonplace in the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries during the so-called progressive era as a mode of preserving and improving dominant groups in the American population. This, of course, refers to the improvement and strengthening of whiteness. Now, if you analyze the timeline, you'll see that the deeply racist and ableist eugenics policies in the United States predated and served as a template to that in Nazi Germany. For example, the forced sterilization program in Nazi Germany was inspired by California's, because the state of California in 1933, I believe, forcibly sterilized more people than every other state in the United States combined. And the Rockefeller Foundation even funded a number of German eugenicist scientists such as Agnes Blum, Alfred Gratian, and Hans Nachsching. And it also played a central role in the establishment of German eugenic institutes such as the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Psychiatry and the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Eugenics, and Human Heredity. So the technologies of Nazi fascism were, at the very least, to be generous, inspired by those of American settler colonialism. And where we see collectively the German Holocaust as something that was deeply deplorable and deeply inhuman, indigenous removal in the United States was and continues to be necessary in order for the American colonial project to thrive. So to paraphrase Akil Mbembe and his work Necropolitics, Nazism did no more than to industrialize the mechanisms of putting people to death and to amplify to a mass scale the processes, ideologies and mechanisms that had already existed within Western European social and political regimes, including the subjugation and commodification of certain bodies, like disabled bodies and queer bodies, social Darwinism and eugenics, and race science, the proponents of which included such illustrious Enlightenment thinkers as Voltaire, Kant, Karl Linnaeus, and Blumenbach, who created the 5-race taxonomy of humans in 1779, from which the misused Caucasian emerged. But it is present practice and socio-political imaginary, the colony, such as the United States, because the settler colonial project isn't over, represents the site where a sovereign peace is more likely to take on the face of a war without end. The war without end can refer to any number of things, but one being the constant invention, articulation, and response to threats, an ever-present and ever-changing enemy, and the reinscription of Americanness and other identities that are subsumed by or excluded by that. The war without end is the effective economy of whiteness. It is the constant state of emergency, of different emergencies or continuing emergencies. So I know my presentation is quite short, but I wanted to open it up for discussion. My question is much the same as Mbembe's. What is the relationship between politics and death within a political system that can only function within a state of emergency, that cannot independently construct state identity, or both externally facing or internally facing, without the constant articulation of perceived existential threats.
I have a question. Okay, so I thought a lot about your example of Zionism earlier on in the presentation, and I guess I sort of like want to have a conversation about that, because I feel like it differs from your other examples in the way that like cultural identity is very inherent to the Israeli state, right? Like, it's not that the state invented the identity, it's that the identity invented the state. And like, do you think that's an important difference, and how do you think that impacts like Israeli politics in general?
You said, so the concept so you said it's not this.
I said the Jewish identity is responsible for the state, not vice versa.
I wouldn't necessarily say that Jewish identity is responsible for the state. I like Ilan Pape. Oh, could you go to the next slide? So I put some like further readings for folks to like check out. Like Ilan Pape, I would say that European anti-Semitism is responsible for the state, not a kind of internal articulation of what it means to be Jewish. Because initially, Zionism was a completely secular ideology,
Right.
and now Zionism as it exists kind of weaponizes Jewishness in particular ways. It is a racialized understanding of Jewishness that excludes, for example, Ethiopian Jews. It's a kind of, it's an identity that I wouldn't necessarily say pays any real respect to Jewishness. Obviously it is not. I mean, so the New Historians are a group of historians in Israel. I think all of them are Jewish, who can speak to this much more than I feel comfortable going any further into saying. But I think cultural identity is important in as much as it was able to kind of weaponize like post-Holocaust guilt and capitalize on the anti-Semitism of Western states that allowed the Holocaust to happen. Because, you know, Ilan Pape says that the creation of Israel in itself is anti-Semitic, because it was basically like the UN creation, and all of the states who no longer wanted Jewish people to be in their country, that allowed the Holocaust to happen, were able to now get rid of all of them and send them to Israel. So there was a real enthusiasm on behalf of Western Europe. And I also do want to say that Zionism in itself, if you have ever read Theodore Herzl's journals, is terrifying. Is absolutely terrifying, because initially he didn't really care where Israel went. He said Uganda, maybe Madagascar, maybe Argentina, maybe. It was kind of an evolution of kind of thought from one that was kind of purely secular to one that kind of relied upon a history, a historical relationship to land.
So, just now you said how, I'm just thinking about how states existing within the state of emergency and like that kind of be a justification of power. And I don't know, personally I can't think of an example of a state that doesn't perpetuate that, or a state that I know of that hasn't existed using enemyship as like at least a fortification of power. But like, do you know of anything that doesn't use that tactic, like, or personally?
I mean, I don't necessarily think that this idea, idea of a state of emergency, Zimbabwe, for example, in its kind of immediate post-colonial period, understanding of like identity crafting, it was not really outward facing. It was not looking at the perceived threats around it. It continues not to. The only threats are kind of old and unresolved threats by colonialism. I think there are a lot of states in the global south that are not invested in this constant state of emergency because they are not part of this kind of global hegemony of kind of world policing. So even if Zimbabwe did have a policy that was kind of like, okay, the South African threat, the Ndebele threat, the everybody threat, it is not the same kind of significance of understanding threats as the empire, if that makes sense. So like, Zimbabwe does not need the threat to thrive, although the threat is a useful kind of weapon for the hedging of state power. But the United States has never been able to grow the state without this understanding of a threat. So while all of these threats are not unique, they play a particular and critical role for these empires that have now lost their power and are now attempting to figure out how to reassert their power, how to maintain dominance in a global arena where they are rapidly losing power and relevance and significance. Well, but maybe that's just me being an idealist, but it's happening, just maybe not as fast. Yeah, if that makes sense.
Yes, I have a question, and I'm really interested, you began your talk by mentioning fear and threat and as a strong political motivator, and that gets manipulated in lots of politics. Then you mentioned love, and I thought that was actually really exciting. And then we haven't come back to love. And I'm wondering, I'll just throw this out here, you know, I mean, can love be problematic too? Because of that attachment to whatever, you know, the sort of, when you were saying, you know, that with Trump supporters right now, you know, is the fear of losing power, which I agree with you. But I think there's also that sort of love can only go so far. You know, I'm going to protect those I love, and so since I can't love everyone, in some ways, does fear and love go hand in hand in a sort of not necessarily way we want to think about it?
So I think that there are two quite distinct ways of understanding love as a politicized emotion, right? So you've got this love that is kind of inherent to the hate of nationalism, and then you have kind of, I don't like the word too much, but a kind of revolutionary love that like kind of reimagines the self. We were just talking about Andrew Lord, that reimagines the self in relation to folks within the community, in relation to people outside of the community, as something that brings you together in solidarity to kind of cast borders away and to cast away identities and to kind of construct this cogent identity in reaction to the violence that you are experiencing as like a marginalized group. So I think that has incredibly liberatory potential. But I also think that in any case, love has limits, right? Because, for example, in order for a non-Black community of color to align itself with a community of with Black folks, you have to overcome anti-Blackness, right? Is love stronger than this deep socialization into an investment in anti-Blackness, you know? So it's something that's incredibly important, that has so much potential, that is really critical to sort of cultivate as we're developing our revolutionary and resistant politics. But I don't think love is all we need. Like, I don't think that love is even close to anything that I don't even think it necessarily ranks in like the top 5 things that we need. I mean, in terms of like this kind of reaction to white supremacy, to colonialism, to violence, I think it has its place. It has an important place, but I think it also has some pretty tremendous limits, because just as you have to learn to cultivate love, and I don't think that this cultivation of love is stronger than the process of trying to unlearn these investments in kind of bigotries and racial normativities that, you know, that we have.
Thank you. It's something I think a lot about.
Also, love is a concept I just don't really believe in, so that's
Well,
that's like it's a whole different conversation. But yeah.
Yeah, I guess in the beginning you just said the way that you like conceptualize whiteness is something that like kind of absorbs not only like propagates not only like anti-Black but also like anti-queer or like disabled people like movements or like just like life, social life. I was wondering if you could speak more to the way that like whiteness, not only is like the way it interacts with like queer politics or stable politics see it in the way that like you see it as like more of an overarching, it's,
System.
for example, like with the family, how like, yeah.
So, whiteness, I mean, a lot of other theorists or whatever will disagree, but I kind of see whiteness as kind of almost a synonym for coloniality. And so within coloniality, you have all of these ways of understanding bodies and identities, of understanding disabled people as being wrong-bodied and not useful, of seeing queer people as being like an aberration to the way that we know family. And so within whiteness, you have racial capitalism, obviously. Within racial capitalism, you understand bodies and labor. You understand sort of certain normativities that gender is something that is fixed and something that is never changing, which is why you have the kind of medical industrial complex and the gatekeeping of trans folks' access to being able to actualize their genders, right? Because you have this investment of, you know, your transgenderism, which, you know, that's what it is, kind of how it's codified in the academy, is like it's some kind of mental illness, it's some kind of disability, and it's diagnosed as now, what is it, dysphoria, gender identity disorder or something. And so in order to have a politic that is resistant of whiteness, and this is something that I really struggle with in a lot of kind of black liberation spaces, is they see whiteness solely as understanding race, right? It's solely a way of like racializing bodies, but in order to racialize bodies, you also have to gender a body. I am not just black, I am not just a woman, I am simultaneously a black woman, and my identity is constructed through this lens specifically of black womanhood. It is not, you know, one and then you simply compound the other and now you have the Zoe. It's, you know. If I were to have a disability, like I would be a black disabled woman, and there are all of these kind of hierarchies and all of these ways of codifying identity within whiteness. And so what I often run into, for example, in like black liberation spaces, is you have people who have really spot on like critical racial analyses, but they don't understand that gender is also an important part of the colonial, of an anti-colonial policy, because I don't cease to be a woman, or sorry, right, yes, I don't cease to be a woman because you now properly understand me as being black. You don't recognize the ways in which, you know, the clearest example that I have for understanding both race and gender at the same time is kind of American slave economies. You have everybody who is black is enslaved. Everybody who is black is used for some kind of labor. But there are certain violences that black women are subjected to because of their womanhood, and certain kinds of violences that black men are subjected because of their manhood, their masculinity, their characterization of being hyper-aggressive and hypersexual and hyper-violent. And in order to kind of understand whiteness, you need to understand all of the different ways that our bodies are understood, through our queerness, through our sexuality, through our gender, through our race, through our physical ability.
I guess I'm gonna kind of build off of like that queerness. I'm really interested in how like whiteness like kind of accepts like very masculine commodified like gayness, if that makes sense. Which is like one of like the worst things that like it's my pet peeve. But I mean, it's kind of like how there's a whole different world for like a straight presenting white gay male versus like a trans person of color.
Right.
Like, and I don't know if you want to like, talk about that or anything, or like.
What exactly?
I think like how do you relate that with fear? I guess because it's kind of like
Okay.
accepting of like you're gay but you act straight.
Right, so I get you.
Yeah.
It's this kind of like the ways in which like heteronormity get reproduced within queerness, right? So you have certain kinds of gay men who are acceptable because, you know, they're very muscular, they're very like straight acting, and within that particular identity, there's often this rejection of there's often like a femme-phobic rejection of like femme men, of trans men for not being real men, for being female, and you have all of these different ways of reproducing whiteness within what are supposed to be kind of radical liberatory politics. I recently was on a panel about Marlon Riggs' Tongues Untied, which is a really interesting movie. Came out in like 89, maybe? And he says this thing over and over again. It kind of is like a maxim for the movie. Two gay black men loving one another is a revolutionary act. And there's something within kind of queer politics where politics of desire, the kind of whiteness as politics of desire get reproduced, right? So you have, in this post-marriage equality world, and you have now the commodification of queerness, and you have a queerness that's sold to us by credit card companies and furniture stores and whatever, you have this proximity of respectable queerness to whiteness, right? Whenever you have an interracial relationship and it's really, really cute, it's always a cisgender queer man of color and his like white partner. You don't ever really get to see two queer men of color loving one another. It all kind of, what is now a respectable queerness, a queerness that we are willing to throw our capitalist weight behind, necessarily looks like the relationships that we find to be acceptable in like straight world, which is relationships all in proximity to whiteness. And the movie is really interesting because it goes through this whole kind of monologue of him understanding queer love through the eyes of his gray-eyed lover, right, this white man. And then he kind of rounds it out with this new understanding that, of two black gay men loving one another as being revolutionary. That was actually a panel that I got heckled on, but because I told him that there was nothing radical about miscegenation, but there isn't. So.
Yeah, I guess like building on that even more, I mean like I think I look towards like pride parades and how there's like this crazy like capitalization of like businesses supporting pride parades.
Police.
Oh, it's like, and I mean I remember there was this giant boycott I believe in LA this past year or in San Francisco of, you know, is pride parades really a space for queer people or is it really a space for you know, capitalism and
straight people.
And straight people to market towards gays and kind of steal all the work that's been put into like the gay rights liberation movement.
Yeah, or also even the complete erasure of trans women's labor from that movement, like that terrible movie Stonewall by whoever it was.
We don't talk about it.
But that.
Yeah.
So which is why I'm really excited about Happy Birthday Marsha and like
Okay.
all the really great movie that like this great stuff that like Rena Gossett is doing. But yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
I actually have a real question after this, but quick commentary. I was in I visited the Pride Parade in Liverpool when they had that, and just an example of what you were saying about capitalization of the Pride Parades. I got a Nando's sticker given to me.
Nando's is like on it when it comes to like co-opting things. Like something weird happens in the news and all of a sudden like 4 days later, Nando's has a commercial.
Yep.
And if it weren't so horrifying, it would be really impressive. Your question?
So my actual question is, I was really excited to hear that you had worked with epidemiology a little bit because I'm starting to approach a lot of this from the epidemiology side into international development and politics. So I guess the question I have right now is, when we talk about violence on bodies, and I'm actually especially interested in necropolitics there.
Oh, it's a beautiful paper. Much better than Foucault's biopolitics.
Good, because I'm not really sure I like Foucault very
Well,
much.
because he's a plagiarizer, but anyway.
Well, I guess I'm just interested in the violence that are done on people in the name of stopping a disease. I'm very specifically thinking about 2014 Ebola outbreak, Sierra Leone. We've got a corrupt politician who's using the excuse of we need to keep these people isolated to destroy his opposition, kind of thing.
I mean, violence done on bodies in the name of medical stuff has been done for how long in the United States? Tuskegee, you've got like these pharmaceutical companies that are using, you know, there's that big case against Pfizer in Nigeria.
Yes.
You've got, I don't know, like, I can't think of things off the top of my head, but it's something that is kind of innate in understanding certain kinds of bodies as being unpersoned, right? Like, you don't need to go through all of the ethical clearance to get an African person to vaccinate their kid because that's not a person. And, you know, a lot of what I'm looking at right now in doing transgender health is understanding the ways that violence structures the way that they materially affect health outcomes. So I'm looking at, so for example, when looking at transgender health, there's a lot of HIV prevention discourse that talks about how transgender women are more at risk for HIV acquisition and transmission because of the risky sexual behavior that they engage in, right? Because of this sole understanding of queered trans bodies as being deviant, as being dirty, as being reservoirs of disease. But what you don't see in understanding the so-called risky behaviors, you don't understand, they're not engaging how trans folks are much more likely to be discriminated against in the workplace. They're much more likely to have higher rates of poverty and homelessness. Poverty and homelessness very frequently drive people to do survival sex. A lot of even sex work literature doesn't talk about the fact that, you know, sometimes you'll be in a position sometimes where someone will tell you that they'll pay you more to not use a condom. And if you are doing survival sex and you have potentially a really fatalistic understanding of like, well, my chances of getting HIV are like super high anyway, so why not? Which is something that's really common in a lot of places. Why wouldn't you go for what is going to, you know, provide you with potentially more money? And so there's this complete neglect of the way that people are deliberately excluded, the way that people are deliberately subjected to violence, and you skip all of this conversation about marginality and you land in the place where people are putting themselves voluntarily, but it's kind of this understanding of voluntarily when you're coerced into a position by poverty and economic marginality and violence, where they are putting themselves in dangerous, risky sexual positions. You know, it's kind of a deliberate kind of truncation of understanding people's identities and understanding people's lives because of this dominant narrative and investment in understanding trans people and understanding certain kinds of bodies and the kinds of things that they engage in quite like kind of violent, normative ways. So yeah, that was my master's research where, you know, everything I learned until I got there about sex workers and about trans people, I learned from non-sex workers and non-trans people. And you know, that was what I kind of highlighted in a paper that I just wrote, the way that we do public health, the way that we do social epidemiology, and we're not in any way responsible to the communities that we're working with. We're kind of beholden to funding. We're beholden to these certain dominant ways of knowing. And we're not self-reflexive and we're not critical about the subjectivities that we hold as out-group people, as cis people, and you know, as a cis woman, walking into these spaces, working with these people, even with the best of intentions that I do have. It's like yelling at a wall most days. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk more about like the movement from a case of emergency to like a regulatory politics through an effective economy, and I guess I get like
the movement,
or like what like the case of emergency as like what's the role of the effective economy, or like why did the effective economy become important to you in relating those to
the case of
emergency to the regulatory fear? Because it seems, I mean, it just seems like a lot of models could be used to make that connection, and I was wondering why you chose that maybe in relation to why you're talking about like a Whiteness History Month instead of like whatever, like a lot of the critiques I hear of like Black History Month are usually about like why only month or something. Like how does ineffective politics get at that sort of at least in like your discussion of like the case of emergency and regulatory politics, like does effective politics allow like an education about like whiteness and masculinity like alongside like queer and Black politics in a different way, or yeah, just wondering about like your choice of the article.
So the case for Whiteness History Month, I'm very much of the like, why do we need a Black History Month, because we should just be kind of decentering whiteness in school. But it was kind of like, it was a joke in that, okay, well you want a White History Month, like let's have a White History Month. Like let's talk about all of the genocides for a while. Let's talk about all of these wars. Let's talk about all of these slave trades. Let's talk about all of these ways of commodifying humans into objects for sale, but that was, I don't know, that wasn't really I mean in my head at least, it wasn't necessarily connected to this, but the reason that the state of emergency and the regulatory economy, or the regulatory kind of policies, the need for the regulatory policy is articulated through the effective economy. So the state of emergency is constructed through this understanding of threat, of constant threat to whiteness, to sort of uncontested dominance. And you construct whiteness, you construct the borders around different communities and different identities through these kind of fear-based or love-based or hate-based or whatever politicized emotions. And in swaying public opinion in particular ways, you are able to have the approval of the people to securitize certain communities, to go to war forever to, you know, have war-based economies forever. You have these effective economies in order to maintain kind of public approval of the politics that you're seeking to maintain dominance, to maintain this kind of constant stream of violence.
I just want to know, like, personally, like, your own thoughts on, like, the Black Lives Matter movement, specifically in terms of having, like, more than one identity within the movement, and how it was initially started by, like, 3, like, Black queer women, how it's sort of been co-opted as being this movement sort of mainly geared towards cisgendered Black men, and how there is, as you were talking about earlier, this still lack of understanding when it comes to sexuality and gender, and why, like, hashtag Say Her Name and, like, Trans Lives Matter had to have come about, because, like, there was no talk going on within these spaces. And just, if you, like, personally would think that there would be a possibility for, like, any, like, one movement, because no movement is, like, perfect, obviously, but if there would be the possibility for any movement where, like, all these inclusions of, like, all of these identities could, like, possibly be able to come together, specifically, like, regarded to, like, Blackness and, like, Black justice.
So because this is being recorded, I will abridge my feelings about Black Lives Matter. But I think that the movement for Black lives falls into the same trap that Black movements have fallen into forever. And there's a very specific reason why the labor of the 3 queer women was quite immediately kind of ignored, and why DeRay has become kind of the face of Black Lives Matter, even though he has a different campaign that is not affiliated with Black Lives Matter. It's this kind of preference for Black masculine leadership. And he is even kind of discarded by a lot of cis hetero Black men because he's gay. But I wrote a piece for the New Inquiry called The Black Movement to Come, which is kind of envisioning this not just not intersectional, but a proper understanding of whiteness and the sort of violence that we're coming up against, which understands Blackness, gendering, sexualizing, disabling, like, all as kind of part of the same structure. And, you know, I don't know if I could say why we continue to have so much trouble doing that, but I will say that it is, a lot of the trouble comes from these kinds of cis hetero Black men who are more invested in kind of reproducing Black patriarchy, because if we were to actually dismantle all of the systems and not just or not just racism, that means that, you know, so much of, you know, the only time that I believe in the emasculation of Black men is when I'm thinking about the emasculation of Black men by white supremacy. And I'm thinking about the ways in which they were constructed as being less than men, right? So much of the way that they understand Black liberation is about taking their power back, and not about the kind of liberation and the freeing of all Black people, you know, gay, straight, disabled, sex workers, poor, whatever. And I don't really know the difference between Black Lives Matter, the movement for Black lives, and all of the other different organizations that fall into whichever one is an umbrella group and which one is like an actual organization, because I don't know. But I think, I wish we didn't have to have identity-specific groups within the Black struggle. I wish we didn't have to have women who are like, okay, so by the way, like, women are also, and for hundreds of years, have been violated by state violence, that Black disabled folks didn't have to be like, hey, by the way, we were subjected to not only white supremacy, but like eugenics. You know, trans folks are just like, hey, by the way, like, we are being murdered at disproportionately high rates and are like overrepresented in the statistics of anti-LGBT violence. You know, I don't know how to change that other than try to do political education and be like, guys, like, it's not just about racism, and even racism isn't just about racialization. It's about the inequitable distribution of resources, right? And like, what does that look like even within Black communities, and the kind of time and attention and love and labor that's given towards the freedom of like different, not sub-identities, but like compounded identities within the Black circle.
So something I've heard come up in like conversations a few times before is that there's like a slowing down of progress in terms of change for the better for minorities, and that like for all the shortcomings of the civil rights movement, that saw more widespread change, and there was more of a like global awareness of it than more recent movements, because it's now an issue of subtleties. So like before, movements could say, when you walk into a school, you see that black kids have different water fountains, and that was something that was really easy to talk about because that was incredibly tangible. But now there's issues of biases and things that are so much more personal to people. And so I guess the question, as like open and vague this is like, how do you see changing those like more subtle and more like rooted in people's, I don't want to say like upbringings, like how do you see that being manifested, like change, how do you see like changing that those more subtle issues actually coming about?
So firstly, I think that I would say that the reason that we saw more changes or more victories or however you want to describe them of the civil rights movement was because there were some like tangible objectives. And the tangible objective was like, we want to be able to vote, we want to be able to use the same facilities, we basically want these citizenship rights as we are very specifically defining them through like ability to vote, ability to like share space, ability to access facilities and all of that. And I think, as I said in this kind of contemporary existential threats, it seems, or at least more people than kind of that's obviously not to say that like radicals have never existed, because that would be like the deepest insult to the Panthers and to everybody who has been doing the work for decades. But now, much more we have like, we want prison abolition. We want to abolish the police. You've got black anarchists, like we want to abolish the state. Like, we want to figure out how to make California Mexico again. I have some like very radical Chicano friends who I love dearly, but I'm just like, guys. But, it's about these kind of humongous structural changes, right? Like, what does it mean to have an America without mass incarceration? Do you have an America without mass incarceration? What does it mean to have an America that is not existing upon the ongoing extermination and removal of indigenous people from their land? What does that look like? It's about like contesting capitalism now. Like what does it mean to have America without racial capitalism? So it seems like it's more different because the objectives are different. Now that we are citizens, which is arguable, we have kind of greater ambitions, which are not quite as easy to actualize. And in terms of, you said subtle things? I don't know if I would call bias subtle, but it's
Something that's harder to like write down on a piece of paper
Yeah.
and say this exists.
I mean, it's something it's actually, there's a reason that police and other people are going after bias, because bias is easy, right? You can untrain someone to see bias. You can't, but you can pretend to.
Yeah.
So you have certain benchmarks now that seem like they're more radical, right? Like bias. I don't know. It's a matter of like white folks recognizing the need for structural change, and it's white folks kind of looking internally and being like, okay, I occupy this particular social position. I derive quite tremendous benefit from this particular social position. When I have children, I am teaching this socialization to my kids. In the conversations that we have with our white friends, we are reproducing these racialized and gendered and whatever understandings inherent to white supremacy. It's a matter of people, of a critical consciousness, right, of consciousness raising, of this Freudian understanding of we will come to a critical mass through education, through conversation, through dialogue. And only through reaching this critical mass is this kind of radical change possible. And, I guess we could wait for that critical mass, have armed struggle and destroy the state. Like, I don't know. I guess armed struggle is not going to happen anytime soon because we've never been in a position where we are quick to mobilize in this kind of visceral reaction to state violence, because I think in part we've never had an authoritarian state. We've never had fascism. We don't really have anything super scary to like get scared of and like move away from. We have a democracy that is comfortable for enough of us that we don't really need to do anything about it. So I guess it's about kind of political education. It's about recognizing the fact that you are a beneficiary of certain kinds of state violence or many kinds of state violence, and that you're also deeply complicit in reproducing those state violences, and seeing how you can become like an accomplice to marginalized communities who are fighting for whatever they're fighting for, as opposed to like retweeting something. I mean, that's cool too, but like, you know, other stuff in addition to retweeting stuff, because critical education and all that is so important. So.
That's a great note to end things on. And thank you so much.